GSON is a Java-based library that converts Java objects into their JSON representation, and vice versa. A common example is when you create a REST endpoint via Spring Controller, where you fetch a list of objects that you want to convert into a JSON array. Let's examine a few different configuration options within your Spring Boot, Java config, and XML-based applications. Before we get started, it is important to understand how Spring converts objects to JSON. In typical Spring MVC, once the request exits the controller, it looks for a view to render. When specifying a request body or a REST controller, we ask Spring to bypass the step and write the Java objects in the model directly to the response. When doing so, Spring will look specifically for an HTTP message converter associated to the MIME type to perform the conversion, and in our case, JSON. Spring configures mapping JSON to HTTP message converter by default, so we will want to swap it with a GSON HTTP message converter, so it uses GSON to convert the Java objects. For our first snippet, let's generate a Spring Boot application from the Spring Initializer webpage and import it into Eclipse. If you are setting up GSON to work with Spring Boot, you will first want to look at HTTP message converter auto configuration, as there may be configuration changes. As it exists during the write-up of this tutorial, GSON message converter will be created if GSON is on your class path, the application doesn't contain JSON generator, and if the GSON bean doesn't already exist. If you want to be sure that JSON isn't being used, or if you're experiencing conflicts, you can exclude the JSON auto configuration from the enable auto configuration annotation. And then you'd want to exclude the JSON dependency from your Spring Boot starter web. If you are trying to eliminate the dependency on JSON, we did notice as we worked through the tutorial that it was needed if you were using Spring Boot Actuator, specifically an endpoint auto configuration class, and it was reported as a GitHub issue. Let's create a controller that returns a hash map to validate message converter is being used. We will modify our application.properties to include a logging level of debug and make a request to the default request mapping. Inspecting the log, we can see that GSON HTTP message converter is being used. If you are having troubles with configurations just discussed or interested in customizing an existing converter by overriding a bean, Spring Boot provides an alternative configuration option. We will create a custom configuration class, but this could be performed in any class that contains a configuration annotation, and create a new bean of type HTTP message converters. In our configuration, we'll instruct Spring Framework to use the default HTTP message converter and then append GSON HTTP message converter. So by default, if we include the GSON POM dependency, it will configure GSON HTTP message converter to be used. Now you might be asking, if the JSON is also included on the class path, how does this work? The default behavior of the HTTP message converters when adding a new converter is to add it to the front of the list, so since JSON is configured before, GSON is configured properly to work. If you haven't moved to Spring Boot yet, you still configure GSON within your application using Java config by extending WebMVC configure adapter, or if you need more control, use WebMVC configuration support. You can read more on how to customize the provided Spring MVC configuration in the Spring documentation. I didn't add a specific test scenario for configuring GSON in XML-based application, but you could do this by specifying an annotation method handler adapter and then creating the GSON HTTP message converter as a message converter property. There has been a lot of debates on which Java library is the fastest JSON processor, and many of them might lose out to the Java 8 JSON API once support broadens. So until then, pick a method and the library above. Thanks for joining in today's Level Up. Have a great day.